Thank you. I'm Howard Sumka. Everything Larry said I have to say for myself. I've known Ari for 30 years. Years ago, he and my wife were colleagues at what's now the Ed Livich JCC. And I was with the U.S. government for 33 years, 25 of them with USAID. And 2 years after Larry left West Bank, Gaza, I arrived as the mission director and was there for 4 years. I had previously been in East Africa, in Albania, and in Sarajevo. And I want to say that being the USAID director for West Bank Gaza was not at the top of my list of things to do. For years I avoided it. I mean, I just didn't express an interest. If you don't express an interest, you don't get the job. And I was happy with that. And then the job became open unexpectedly. And my wife said, after having said, I only want to go home or maybe stay in Sarajevo, this job came up, and she said, I'll go to Tel Aviv. There we were. And it was a very dramatic change in my life, which we could get to in a minute. So Larry, why don't you start us off with your reflections on the years you were there, the years post-Oslo, what you have described as going from the best of times to the worst of times.
Sure. So, as I said, I arrived there in 1999, and one of the themes that I think comes out both in the play and particularly in the commentary by the character that plays Shoshi and the character that plays Shalhevet, is the perspective of 30 years later. So, Rabin was killed in 1995 and. 95, November 4th, and there was a sense then that the peace process was going to come to a halt. 6 months after he was killed, there was an election in Israel, and it was Shimon Peres against Benjamin Netanyahu, and Netanyahu won, despite everyone's assuming that Peres would win and would at least receive a sympathy vote or whatever, but instead Netanyahu won. And so there was both the mourning about the assassination and the mourning of Netanyahu's victory and what this might mean for the peace process. And yet the process continued through particularly some very effective U.S. negotiations under President Clinton and his team, resulted in the Y River Accords, which were agreed to in 1998, and 10 months later I arrived as the USAID mission director in West Bank, Gaza, and I describe it as the best of times. This was a high time for Oslo. We really thought we were on the way to a peaceful, long-term settlement with two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace. When I got there, my sister, who had been living there for 20 years, and I should put an aside, she and the author of the book have gone to the same synagogue in Jerusalem for the past 40 years together, so little connection there. But she was working for the Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, on projects bringing Palestinians and Israelis together in the health sector. This is not anything I was involved with, but this is just her work as an Israeli citizen at the time. And then I'm coming there to implement what was a very large USAID program, one of the largest at that time in our, amongst all the USAID programs, doing major infrastructure projects in West Bank and Gaza, doing health projects, community service projects, and working with the Palestinian Authority on governance issues, legislative reform, judicial reform, regulatory reform. And we were all excited. And about in October, in July was when President Clinton convened the Camp David meetings, bringing Chairman Arafat and Prime Minister Barak to Camp David. And at the time, just a quick anecdote, my deputy and I were driving to the West Bank, and he said to me, he said, Larry, I think it's time that we should start looking for a office in Ramallah, because we're going to soon have to move to Ramallah. And that was sort of the spirit of the time, that, you know, this was going to work. And then it all came crashing down, starting in October 2000 with the outbreak of the Second Intifada. We honestly didn't think it would be a long, conflict. We thought it would be over, as previous outbreaks had been, in a week or two or three. And it took about 3 months before my team in Washington said, you know, Larry, this isn't going to end. We really need to redefine our program. And so we did redefine the program, but some of the basic principles were maintained. And so even though these were the worst of times, with bombings almost every week, we were under limitations of where we could travel. So previously I'd gone to Gaza on a weekly basis. I'd been able to drive my own car into the West Bank. Now we were restricted from doing any of these trips on our own, and even to get to the West Bank, we had to go with considerable security. But we kept the hope, we kept the program alive, and we believed that there would be a better day, and that was what kept us going. And yet the Intifada continued through the end of 2004. Arafat died. President Abbas was elected in January 2005, and then, you know, we thought we were going to again go on a upward trajectory, and there were elections for the PLC, and Hamas was elected. And I'm going to hand it over to Howard now to talk a little bit about what it was like, you know, coming in with Hamas now in power, and how we, the U.S. government, tried to interact with Palestinians, continue our program, but also deal with the reality of what was now a unfriendly government.
So, as Larry said, I got there in 2006. The Second Intifada was long over by then, but the January election, in which Hamas won the legislative majority in the Palestinian Authority, completely shut down almost all U.S. government programs. And worse than that, we were forbidden from having any kind of interaction with anybody in the Palestinian Authority who was not in the president's office. President Abbas was considered trustworthy and a friend, but the Palestinian prime minister at that time was Ismail Haniyeh, who was the head of Hamas, and I'm sure some of you must know him. He was recently assassinated by Israel in Iran, in Qatar, and we were prohibited from having any kind of interaction. Our budget was cut back. I don't know what it was at its high point when Larry was there, but it was back to $50 million a year, which sounds like a lot of money, but in the development business, it isn't much, and it wasn't even much back 20 years ago. We had another 85 million that had been sequestered, and it ultimately got allocated to the U.S. security coordinator, who was training Palestinian security forces. So I got there at the scene where our projects were mostly shut down. We did little things at the edges. And then, you know, there was this mixed blessing, from my perspective, a very mixed blessing. In June of 2007, Hamas evicted the Fatah officials and military personnel who were in Gaza. They took over Gaza, and we all of a sudden had a complete separation between Gaza and the West Bank. And all the prohibitions we had about not even speaking to anybody who's associated with the Hamas government no longer pertained to the West Bank. The West Bank was completely under Fatah control. In the summer of 2007, Salam Fayyad was appointed prime minister. He was a very well-known and well-liked senior official. He was the Minister of Finance. Before that, he worked for the international community, World Bank, IMF. I worked for IMF in Palestine. And instead of being in a situation where I couldn't even talk with a woman who was a citizen of the United States who had family in New York because she was a mid-level person in the so-called unity government, I was suddenly in a situation where I could work with everybody in the Palestinian Authority. One of the first things we did was to put together an entourage and go to Jenin. The way was paved by the Prime Minister, and I went with the U.S. Security Coordinator, and we spent the whole day talking about how we were going to turn Jenin into an economic haven. 2 years later, we had made a big step on that, in that regard, and we completed the crossing between northern Israel, between Israel and Jenin, and opened it up to commercial activity, which rejuvenated the entire economy. At the same time, the international community was moving again. So we had in 2007 what was known as the Annapolis Conference, because it took place in Annapolis, Maryland. And it was a commitment of the international community to support the development of the Palestinian Authority, to support economic development in the West Bank. There was very little talk about Gaza, if any. Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of Britain, was named the international envoy for leading the international work with them. About a month later, there was a donors conference in Paris at which the U.S. pledged $600 or $900 million in assistance, money that USAID would get, also money that went to UNRWA and other agencies through the State Department. Things were going swell, and then we had the first Gaza War, what in retrospect became known as the first Gaza War, which was Operation Cast Lead in the winter of 2008, went on for some weeks into 2009. And the astounding number of casualties on the Palestinian side was 1,400. It was just an outrage because there had never been so many Palestinians killed in a conflict with Israel. You can see where we've come. The rest of my time there was spent, I left in 2010. We spent a lot of time trying to put together humanitarian assistance programs for Gaza. There was a donors conference in Sharm el-Sheikh. Hillary Clinton came. It's the first time I ever sat in a room with Hillary Clinton. Wasn't so exciting. We pledged $900 million to Gaza, and came through with much of the money. I doubt that we came through with all of it. What I'd like to say about Oslo, which was the legacy of Rabin, seems important to talk about it, is that I never thought Oslo was dead. I mean, Oslo was struggling for sure, but the structures of Oslo still existed, and we still worked with them. The so-called Paris Protocol, which dictated the financial relationships between Israel, which collected taxes on behalf of the Palestinians and was required to send that money across, they were still going. They are still honored in the breach today. Smotrich has frozen all of the transfers, but the protocols are still there. There was a joint economic committee, a joint water committee, a joint civil administration committee. not all these committees functioned. The last meeting, as far as I know, of the Joint Water Committee happened in my office in 2010, because USAID was the convener of the Palestinian and the Israeli water sides, and we almost had fisticuffs at the table between the Palestinian and Israeli water authority heads. But I always thought Oslo was still going. In that period, Salam Fayyad developed the plan for a Palestinian state. The plan was, the path to the plan was developed 2009. The plan itself actually went into the international community in 2013, and ironically, the Israelis protested it because it violated the Oslo Accords, even though they've been doing non-stop settlement building in all of that time. So, talk about your feelings about how you see the work in this sector now, and
So, I mean, one thing is that, and both Howard and I are involved. I mean, I left West Bank, Gaza, Palestine in 2004 in this job. Howard left in 2010, but we still are engaged in various ways, including the fact that we get together the group of former USAID mission directors from 1994 through 2018 on a regular basis, mission directors, deputy mission directors, to talk about developments today, what's going on, how things have changed, and how things are hopefully going to improve. And we've done this, including through the last 2 very difficult years. But both Howard and I have stayed engaged. I am now working as a policy advisor, or policy fellow at J Street. I'm also very involved with Givat Chaviva, which works on issues relating to creating a shared society within Israel. I mean, I really appreciated in the play where Rabin talks about the issue of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. They are 20% of the population, and part of the challenge for Israel is how to feel that those citizens are integrated into the society. And so what I've seen, starting with, in a sense, Rabin's assassination, is this, high points and low points, but enough sense of energy, particularly from Israeli organizations that have continued the good fight, and Palestinian organizations too, that have continued the good fight, that I feel obliged to keep going, even in the darkest days. And so that's true now, and this place sort of reminds me of why, of that reality, that there are people who are still looking for hope. And so I particularly identified with the character Shoshi at the end, talking about her children and grandchildren and the choices that they're making, and she's still there, and she's still fighting for the peace, even though her children and grandchildren are so conflicted. Mm-hmm. So Howard, maybe you can say a few words about your...
So in the group of 7 or 10 of us who are the former mission directors or deputy directors, I think I'm on top of the pessimist pack. I have a great deal of difficulty with some of this these days. We have seen decades of work obliterated in Gaza. We are seeing similarly in the West Bank, decades of work being obliterated. It doesn't make it in the news nearly as much, but I've noticed the Washington Post had a front page story about what's going on in the West Bank recently. And I was profoundly affected by October 7th. I remember it like I remember November 22nd, 1963. I know exactly where I was and what I was doing. And it's hard to carry that with you. And I was profoundly offended by everything that went on. And I was very much offended by some of the organizations that in the first day after the attack took it upon themselves to blame Israel. I mean, Israel has a lot to be blamed for and is a lot responsible for a lot, but that attack was so brutal and so ugly. Still, like Larry, I stay involved. I'm also in J Street. I'm the co-chair of the DC Metro chapter. Any of you want to be involved in the local J Street activities, just let me know. And I'm on the board of directors of the American Friends of the Parent Circle Families Forum, which is the Bereaved Families Association. And I was very excited to see there's going to be a play about Colin McCann's book, Apiragon. I was just before the COVID shutdown. My wife and I were in New York at I think it was at the 92nd Street Y, where Colin McCann and the two protagonists of the book, Bassam Armin and Bassem Rame, were talked through the book. It had just come out, and I'm very excited to see what this play is going to be like. So I'm pessimistic. I am very concerned about what's going to happen when Israel has an upcoming election, which will be any time from between now and next October. I don't think it's a guarantee that Netanyahu's going to be out. And if he's not, then I don't know that I see much of a future for Israel on the immediate horizon. So I keep fighting the fight. I won't quote that way overused quote from Pirkei Avot about not finishing the task. If you don't know what it is, ask a Jewish friend. Because we all know, we all say it way too much. So I guess we can open it up for comments and discussion.
Thank you.
We don't need the mic.
Well, I will use it anyway. An amazing play, really strong and very moved me a lot. Almost brought me to tears to see what the wasted opportunities have been. Also, though, in the back of my mind, and you answered the question somewhat, that in itself, as important and terrible as it was, should not have derailed the Oslo Accord. But I guess the election of Netanyahu might have slowed it down. I don't know, but I think, but the question I have to you is, what about the most recent developments in the UN? Doesn't that give you some hope for the future?
So let me quickly answer the first part, which is, what I was trying to say is that Rabin was killed, and we all thought that was the end, and Netanyahu was elected, and that was sort of, given what you saw in the play, was, what they had wanted. And yet, 2 years later, there was an agreement that Bill Clinton had pushed through with Netanyahu reluctantly agreeing. And when I got there 8 months later, we really thought we were on a positive trajectory. There was virtually no terrorism attacks in the first year and a half that I was there. We were moving forward with these big projects. The Palestinian Authority was taking responsibility for both Gaza and the West Bank. So there was a sense, even after Rabin died, that was possible. And as Howard said, even after the Second Intifada and even after Hamas had been elected, there was at least a sense on the West Bank that we could move forward on Oslo. In terms of, today, again, I try to keep hopeful, even though when I do the analysis, I don't come out much different than Howard does, but I just believe that we need to stay engaged as the United States and as individuals. and there'll be another time when there'll be opportunities for the type of positive developments that there were back then.
Thank you. I am curious what your thoughts might be with regards to Rabin's statement that was, of course, quoted again, that you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. And it's interesting, I think on the way here, I heard an NPR report where they talked about Hamas officials going to Cairo today for some continued talks. And so it just struck me that using the word officials is a very different description than using the word terrorists. And I was placing no value judgment on it. But my question really goes to US policy, if one could actually define one currently, and whether talking to terrorists, talking to Hamas officials on behalf of Gazans, on behalf of Israelis, in your mind, has the potential to lead to anything forward moving?
So, for sure, you don't need to have peace negotiations with your friends. You know, you need to have them with enemies. The U.S. has a long history of somehow working out to engage with terrorist organizations. Hezbollah in Lebanon is a classic example. In Lebanon, it has something of a government, but really Hezbollah was calling the shots there, at least until this past war. Everybody bid good riddance to Hezbollah, and we hope they stay away. And we have in other situations around the world negotiated with the people that we consider the enemy. We did the same thing in Bosnia with Milosevic. He was the universal bad guy, but he went to Dayton with Richard Holbrooke, and Holbrooke beat them all into submission and came up with a peace plan, and it's basically held. And some of the things in Trump's 20-point plan that was adopted more or less by the UN Security Council parallel what was done in Bosnia. The circumstances were entirely different, and we can talk about that also. But you know, I've forgotten his name because I don't do well with names anymore. But there is someone, very right-wing, pro-Israel American NGO. You must know who it is, who's quoted as saying, "You don't make peace with your enemies. You make peace with the people that you have totally defeated and subjugated and demoralized, and then you can go to them and talk about peace." It's a very different view, and I personally don't subscribe to it, but I don't think that's such an unusual attitude among the pro-Israel politicos.
First, it's interesting because I had forgotten. I was actually doing also work back in 1995, much more on Bosnia than I was on Palestine. And so the 30-year anniversary of the Dayton Accords, which is this weekend actually, is has been on my mind. And I think Howard's right that a lot of folks looked askance at Holbrooke and others for bringing Milosevic in and treating him like an honorable guy when he was an indicted war criminal. I think, Trump and his team, to the surprise of many, and have reached out in a way to the Hamas officials that was not previously done. In 2006, when the election occurred, that Hamas won a plurality, but was the largest faction in the legislature, several folks, including myself, suggested that we might adopt a different approach to Hamas than just totally reject them from having any interactions with them create sort of what we call the low bar as opposed to the high bar that was established. I don't know. I mean, Hamas clearly is not one person, one group. There are different people representing Hamas. Clearly, I shared Howard's view. October 7th was an absolute horrific day. The people responsible for, were guilty of war crimes. But today, in terms of where we go from here, I don't think we're going to exclude Hamas from a process moving forward.
Fran has a question.
I can talk loud.
Go ahead.
I have a question for Howard and Larry, and then a question about the play.
Yes.
The play obviously is based on historical facts, but it is a play. So I was wondering if, all of the drama about whether Rabin should wear the vest is accurate, and also whether his decision not to take out Yigal Amir, even though he was on the security list, was also accurate. So that was a question about the play.
Well, just to clarify, the scene where they're talking about the leopard has nothing to do with Yigal Amir and has to do with an operative in Lebanon.
And I don't think,
Oh, I misunderstood that, obviously.
no, it was a leading official, but I don't think it was like the day of November 3rd or 4th.
Okay.
And I think there was a little conflation.
There is a little conflation there. The bulletproof vest issues are substantiated by the historical record. The Yasser Arafat phone call is an interpolation of reporting that David Makovsky has done, where Arafat told him explicitly that he warned Yitzhak Rabin about wearing a vest and warned him about attempts on his life because Arafat had an interest in Rabin staying alive. So that phone call didn't happen that way. The exchange of New Year's greetings didn't happen that way, but the relationship between them is substantiated by reporting.
Thank you, and thanks for clearing up how I saw that scene, which was clearly wrong. My question for you guys
No,
is...
it's a good point for us as storytellers that it remains a little obscure for some audiences. So that's not your fault, it's more in ours to clarify better.
Not fault.
I think in the program, there is a reference to the sense that there wasn't, a couple of things were conflated or things like that. So for example, I think the terrorist attacks that were referred to as having happened in the month or two before the assassination really had happened
Several
6
months before, yeah.
Yeah.
And what.
It is a play, so you understand that doesn't. My question to you guys is, and I feel kind of ignorant not even knowing, is there a USAID program at all that's happening in the West Bank? And how would USAID be part of this international assistance force that's part of the 20-point plan?
Here comes Howard with the bad news.
So USAID no longer exists, period. There
Not
are
at all.
70,
No.
there are 70 employees, I think, is that the last number we heard? And their jobs, I mean, this administration doesn't know anything, obviously, about how you run a government and is happily ignorant about that. They just want to pull it apart. But there are people working and they're doing very unsexy things like closing out contracts, reconciling financial accounts, all of the hard work that we used to do to keep our programs accountable and transparent to the public and to the Congress, which imposed huge oversight rules on us. It was a lot of effort. So there is no USAID. There are some USAID functions that are in the State Department, but they're trivial, they're minimal, and they don't have the skills or the capacity to do what USAID was able to do. So I think, we may have to create a new thing, but it's not going to happen during the Trump administration. The question will be what can be resurrected, what form should it take? I think there's don't think there's anybody who worked for USAID who thinks we should recreate the agency exactly like it was, because, you know, it had its flaws and there are things we could have done better. But right now, it's just not there. It's not going to be part of what happens now.
So I always give the more upbeat piece of this. So I mean, Howard's absolutely right about USAID and its dismantling and destruction.
Short memory.
But in terms of West Bank, Gaza, Israel, so one project was allowed to survive, a project to provide support to hospitals in East Jerusalem, plus several humanitarian assistance programs were allowed to survive. They're now being run not by USAID, but by the State Department, as Howard suggested. But perhaps more significant, when USAID was dismantled, shut down the mission that had been operating since 1994, they decided to hire several, 15 people actually, 3 US nationals plus 12 local nationals by the embassy who came from USAID. So they moved from what was USAID mission, they now work in the embassy. And they're playing an important role in what's now been created as part of the Civil Military Coordination Center that has been established in Kiryat Gat in south of Israel. And we'll see I mean, there's no money yet associated with it, so it's not clear what type of financial commitment we would make. But there is at least a nucleus of folks who have the experience of having worked for USAID for 15, 20, 25 years as local staff, who are involved in some of the planning activities that are underway. Where that goes, I don't know, but I feel it's important at least to acknowledge and in some ways encourage that.
I think we'll take 2 more and then close it out.
Great.
Could you speak to the role of the US in enabling Israeli policies over the last 30 years? And what kind of change we might imagine on the horizon, even beyond the current administration, as a result of the changes we're seeing in US public opinion, especially among the young, who are going to become larger and larger proportions of the vote?
Well, U.S. government has certainly been an enabler of Israel for a long time and a very explicit supporter of it. We are just soon, a couple of years, coming to the end of a 10-year military financial assistance agreement that provides Israel with most of its high-powered and sophisticated weaponry, much of which is bought in the U.S., but it's the way it gets paid for. I, for one, and many others, was appalled by the Biden administration's approach to the October war. I thought that we enabled a lot of things that we should not be associated with. I was very proud of Chris Van Hollen, who's a favorite of mine that I see quite frequently as a J Street lobbyist. I'm not a lobbyist, I take it back, an advocate. Which was to get Biden to sign a national security mission, whatever it's called. I can't remember the acronym, that restricted sales of some weapons to Israel. This was in the middle of the but yes, we have enabled Israel in many ways, and it's about American domestic politics, as you implied, or said explicitly. And right now, you know, J Street likes to say that a number of politicians are moving away from AIPAC, and they're responding to the younger generation's perspectives on support for Israel. I mean, I think that's a double-edged sword. I am not I don't know how to say this. I am not an anti-Zionist. I certainly believe in the Jewish state in its ideal form. As a rabbi friend of mine said to me once in a conversation, you know, Howard, it's not easy to be a liberal Zionist these days. And it's true. You wind up in all twisted kinds of arguments. But I think we're going to see a change. I think we're going to see politicians moving in different directions. But we have to wait and see how the elections go and how much AIPAC and DFMI, the Democratic Majority for Israel, which is an organization, they collect a lot of money for political candidates. I'm hoping there will be changes, and we'll see. And you never can predict with Trump. He swings from one side to the other, and first he's totally supportive of Israel and bombs the Iranian nuclear plants, and then he's leaning on Netanyahu and embarrassing him over the attack on Qatar. So who knows what he'll do tomorrow? You can ask Mamdani what he thinks about what.
Julia, we'll give you the last question.
Okay, thank you. I have a question about the play, actually.
Sure.
So in the play, Yigal Amir is represented as finding a justification for his action in the Talmud on his own. I have heard, maybe mistakenly, that he was counseled by rabbis in the community who endorsed this interpretation, perhaps lent support to his action, and I was curious whether that has been documented or substantiated by the record.
You're saying yes. You want to answer that
I
question?
don't know, I don't know the specifics, that's from what was always my
Yeah.
understanding.
I mean, there clearly were, during that time, rabbis and others who were claiming there were sources that justify, along the lines of what was produced in the play, that it's called rodef. You can kill someone who's chasing after someone who's going to be killing. After the assassination, basically everyone who had talked about that, sort of said, no, that we weren't really meaning that in a literal sense. It was more of just a justification. But it, I think it did affect people like Yigal Amir, who was a student at Bar Ilan University Law School. There was a milieu of folks who had come, to be very radicalized, and there were clearly rabbis and others who were provoking them. But you don't even have to look at the, the rabbinical justification. Just as I think comes out in the play pretty well, the rallies that were being organized at that time by, with Netanyahu's participation. I mean, Netanyahu also backed away from, we certainly didn't intend on killing Rabin. We weren't encouraging that. But you look at the rallies and you see, him standing there with all the descriptions that I think came out in play with their Nazi uniforms, kissing with Arafat, whatever else it was, to make it clear that Rabin was a traitor. And so the religious justification probably impacted to some extent Amir, but it wasn't the only thing that was there at the time.
Well,